Welcome to the Fermyn Woods Contemporary Art Podcast, guest curated and presented by Subterra. I am your host and one half of Subterra, Marie-Chantal Hamrock. We invite you to get lost in the unknown as we take a stroll through rich woodlands, dark forests, and subterrestrial landscapes. As we navigate these eerie and unfamiliar spaces, we will explore artist talks, discussions, and original commissioned sound art. Hello everyone, the warmest of welcomes to another Xylophobia episode of the podcast. So the format of this episode is a little different from previous ones, as today we are experimenting with the music and talk feature on Spotify, which allows for tracks to be integrated into conversation. I'll explain a little bit more about how this works after I introduce today's guest and featured artist, Spencer Graham. Spencer Graham is an artist based in Northamptonshire. His practice revolves around a deep interest in music and questions ideas relating to materiality and place. Utilizing and sharing very specific collections of music acquired according to self-set constraints, he considers how we access, consume, use, and most importantly, listen to music. Spencer's deep interest in music and the everyday has led him to work with CDs, cassettes, and MP3s as his primary media for the last 10 years. Xylophobia Shinrin-yoku is a series of 3 audio mixes by Spencer, produced for the Xylophobia online exhibition, which is running until the 22nd of April 2024. Consisting of compilations of tracks titled after the specific words Xylophobia, which as we know by now is the fear of wooden objects, and Shinrin-yoku, which is the Japanese term for forest bathing and encouragement of spending time in nature. The third and final mix will be comprised of selections from the first 2 mixes, chopped, looped, and layered, to explore the contrasts suggested by the opposing track titles Xylophobia and Shinrin-yoku, with the addition of field recordings from Fermyn Woods. So, before we listen, I'll explain how the music and talk feature works. As I mentioned previously, this feature allows us to play music throughout the episode. However, if you are listening outside of Spotify, unfortunately no tracks will play. If you are a premium user of Spotify, you will hear the entire track, but free users will only be able to access 30 seconds of each track. If you do not have Spotify or are simply curious about the music played, all tracks will be listed in the transcript for this episode.
For me, it's that sort of turning point in my practice when I started to really sort of think about music. And whilst not a musician, music has kind of formed a central part of my practice for a good while now. And there was a point whereby I started to work with music formats, if you will, records, cassettes, CDs, etc. And that turning point came when I started seeing lots of copies of the original 12-inch version of Blue Monday by New Order, the 1983 pressing with the floppy disk-esque cover designed by Peter Saville. I kept seeing these for about 50p in car boot sales. And then I read an article in a magazine by the DJ Errol, or about the DJ Errol Alkan, and he said, I think at that point he had about 14 copies. I had multiple copies, but I didn't have anywhere near 14. And it just got me thinking about the idea of an owners club for something that was kind of sort of relatively low sort of monetary value, and I thought of that sort of as sort of the opposite of, say, like a really, really high-end sports car or something like that. You sort of traditional owners clubs. So it started off as a web project, and I literally just put a call out for photographs of people holding their copy of the said record, Blue Monday by New Order, but it had to be the 1983 version. So I was quite specific about it. I didn't want the later 1988 version, and I wanted it to be like the original sort of first pressing. And that website was around for a good while, and it just got me really, really interested in music, but music formats, collecting. So I was collecting the photographs, but I was also collecting copies of the record. So I continued to find them for 50p, and more than 50p. The price kind of subsequently went up.
Right.
But yeah, I sort of bought multiple copies, and I also asked for people's memories of that record, or if anything they can remember, maybe where they bought it or where they heard it and things like that. So I started to get these kind of quotes from people, and I found that element really, really interesting as well. So the way that sort of like music sort of connects us, and people all have their own different stories about this particular record. And then from there, I started reading a lot more about the crossover with the sort of visual arts and music. I remember reading in Nicholas Burio's book, Post-Production, where he kind of likened, I can't remember the exact quote, but he kind of likened sort of contemporary artists to DJs, sorry. And that kind of really resonated with me. And then I sort of moved on to doing other works that were about particular records or particular bits of music. So that's kind of how it started for me, really.
Yeah. I mean, I guess it's no different to just the found object or the ready-made in art, really. Like, because I think a lot of artists kind of gravitate towards markets and charity shops and, trying to find things to collect. But this has an extra element to it, because then it is also like sonic material as well as visual.
Absolutely, yeah. And I mean, at that point, I was, whilst I was obviously it was quite possibly my favorite 12-inch ever. I was purely dealing with it from a sort of visual point of view. It's a website, and I had the images, and it was kind of, I hadn't really sort of thought about actually utilizing or using the music in any way. That kind of came quite a bit later, really. But it was definitely the piece of work where I kind of moved from being, sort of a visual artist to maybe a visual artist that also works with music. So I see it as like a definite turning point, really.
Yeah. So you mentioned as well about how you've been reading works by people like Daniela Cascella and Salome is it Vogelin?
I believe so, yes.
And their kind of ideas of listening as practice. And so how did the kind of research emerge from? Did you listen to the things you were collecting? Or at this point, was it still just more visual in that sense?
Yeah, at that point, it was more visual. But I was interested in the quotes from other people very much. So those quotes went on the website as well. So you had the image of the owner, their first name, roughly their region, and then if they wanted to give me a quote, a quote about the piece as well. And that kind of got me thinking about lots of people kind of related or talked about, sorry, should I say, where they heard the record. They either remembered John Peel playing it, or they remembered doing it. One of them was like someone used to do like a BMX routine with their friend or their brother to this record, and things like that. It's just fascinating. So it got me thinking about where we might be when we hear certain sort of iconic tunes and things like that, sort of real groundbreaking tunes. And that kind of, I started to work with text a little bit, and I did a couple of pieces of work where I was kind of disseminating texts a bit like someone might flyer, because I always used to see people flyering outside clubs and think, oh, that would be really great. I'm sure it probably isn't, because you stay up for ridiculous hours, and I'm assuming the pay probably isn't that good. But I like the idea of being part of that culture. So I did a couple of works that were text based that I was careful not to call flyers because they didn't serve the same function as a flyer. But there's one particular piece from 2007 called While the Tune Groove Le Chord Was Playing. And that is about the track Groove Le Chord by Errol Bricker. And it was a record that I'd heard repeatedly when I'd gone to Detroit. And it took me a while to figure out what the tune was, because I didn't know it at that point. And that I found out what the tune was, and I wanted to make this text-based work that I'd hand out to people whilst that tune was playing. So it literally starts with the words, "I handed you this while the tune Groove Le Chord was playing." And then it kind of goes on to explain itself, and it talks about the fact that this piece of text, it's not an advert, because it's not necessarily advertising anything. But it's about marking that moment in time. It's about marking that particular time when that music was playing. And now clearly it's a somewhat ridiculous idea, because the likelihood of me ever having that with me when I heard the tune playing, because I'm not one for setting I could set up a sound system and play it and hand them all out in one fell swoop, but that wasn't the idea. It was that anticipation of waiting for it to come on and then handing it out as quickly as I could whilst it was still playing. I printed 1,000. I think I've probably still got about 950 of them. So, in terms of judging the success of a work, it's more about those moments when I did hand it to people, and I kind of got some great moments from people. But I've still got hundreds and hundreds of them, and probably will never get rid of them. I think that's also, I'm very, very interested in specifics. When I was a student, I was very interested in site specificity, and I guess I've brought that with me. So whilst my practice has changed over the years, that idea of kind of specificity is through pretty much everything that I do.
Yeah, and there's a real element of chance in that as well, isn't there? Like,
yes,
and also it's making me think a lot of, well, the ephemera of both the flyer or the leaflet involved in kind of music, but also in political campaigns, but then also something I love to look at is like old artist posters. Like, for example, Joseph Beuys's posters from his exhibitions are like some of the most amazing parts of his work.
Absolutely.
You know what I mean?
Absolutely. And there's another great artist who worked with kind of, recorded sound and, records, cassettes and the like, and sound's obviously very important in his practice. But I absolutely agree. Yeah, the idea kind of when you look through sort of contemporary art catalogues that might reproduce, like you say, like old sort of tickets, posters, flyers from sort of previous sort of configurations of those works. I think it's really, really interesting. It's fascinating. And it's the idea of wear as well. I'm really interested in the idea of kind of, it might not be the pristine thing that you find or collect or buy, but the traces of wear that you find on, a secondhand record that you pick up in a charity shop, or, a dog-eared book that you might find in a secondhand bookshop. All those things are really fascinating to me as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So how did that sort of line of research then how did you transition towards, for example, the works that you've been creating for Fermyn Woods?
So it kind of went from thinking about the physicality of sort of Blue Monday and my collection of Blue Monday 12-inch singles, and then through the sort of text-based pieces that I mentioned, through to very specific collections of records. So I think it was 2013. I was part of a group exhibition at Avenue Gallery at University of Northampton with A Place in Time, a research group. And the whole research group was about place and time. And I, as you might have gleaned from the conversation so far, I'm sort of quite obsessed with Detroit. I've been there many times, and I'm interested in it as obviously a concrete place, but also how it's represented through things like record sleeves or CD artwork or flyers or posters and things like that. And I decided to find as many records that were pressed in 2012 that included the word Detroit in the title, or the artist, should I say. So basically, the exhibition sort of approximated a sort of independent record store, really. So I made a unit on which sat a turntable and an amplifier and headphones, and then I built shelves and put all the records on the shelves, sort of facing out from the wall, so you could see the sleeves and the artwork and the record labels. And one quick sort of glimpse at that, you'd realise that, you know, straight away that all of these records somehow had a reference to Detroit. It wasn't all music from or by artists from Detroit. It was all manner of music, different genres, sort of different parts of the world. And that's what I found really fascinating as well. It's like, how do other people represent this particular city, both sonically, but also visually through the label artwork and the record sleeves and things like that. So the idea of kind of, you know, the collections and specificity and the idea of how you might represent a particular place, it sort of all came together in that particular installation. And then from that, I kind of moved, I did various other, I did something not dissimilar in Coventry, whereby I found music that referenced Coventry in either song title or artist name. But in this instance, rather than the records being there to listen to, I actually made like a mixtape. And I made each, I only had 4 available there within the exhibition. And appropriately, the Walkmans were there as well, so you could kind of listen to them on the Walkmans. But I made each tape separately. I didn't make a master one and then dub the other 3. I actually recorded each one separately. So there'll be kind of minute differences in terms of kind of gaps between songs and things like that. But it was very important that I did that rather than just, you know, dubbed a whole lot. It was not a commercial venture. It was literally like a tape you might make, you know, your best mate or someone you fancied, you know, back in the day. You'd make this tape and you'd give it your all, and then you'd hand it over to this person. So it's a little bit like that in a way. And the idea was that people would take the Walkman around the city and listen to this particular tape, and then also they could also look at the records and the CDs from which I'd recorded. So all of that was there as well. But instead of being able to listen to them in any order, they were in the order on the mixtape. So it was kind of an extension of that Detroit project, I guess. But there was sort of subtle differences in there. I wonder if a DJ would play a record because it had an image of Detroit's Renaissance Centre on the record sleeve, you know, which is the kind of, you know, that's another thing. I've got a collection of like, I think 50 plus records now that all feature, you know, this collection of towers in Detroit, the Renaissance Centre, or Renaissance, if you're in America, designed by John Portman. And I'm fascinated because these 7 towers crop up on flyers, postcards, record sleeves, you know, CD artwork, all the time. You know, if anyone wants a signifier for Detroit, it's quite often these 7 towers. So I'm kind of fascinated by that.
It's I mean this in the best way possible, but it's a little bit neurotic and
it is, absolutely.
It's kind of like a little personal cabinet of curiosities almost, in a way, you know, that it's such a reflection of your interest and your like little obsessions, or, you know, like, and that's really fascinating that you know, using this sonic material, that it can reflect so much of yourself, that even though you are not the person to make the song, or, you know, I find that really
absolutely. I mean, that's the thing. I think it's getting that balance between something that is incredibly obsessive, but not so obsessive that it doesn't reach other people and it doesn't resonate with other people. And I think up till now I've managed to kind of do that. it's kind of, I think the point where it becomes so obsessive that no one else is interested in it whatsoever is the time when I maybe give up and change tack and do something different. But yeah, I think when you do make that connection, it's fantastic.
Absolutely.
And I always think back to kind of, the independent record shop and those kind of conversations that people have over the counter and how sort of important they are. And, it's great. And I think if I can kind of get a bit of that in what I'm doing, I feel like I've won really, or it's been a success.
Yeah, it's no different to kind of reading, I don't know, the letters sent from someone to someone else, or it's just a different form of that.
Yes.
Kind of, or like archives of diaries, and it's really, really lovely in that way. And I know we spoke a wee bit about kind of the implications of imposing a restraint, like using Detroit, or for this project with the Xylophobia kind of theme. And it's interesting that I thought of it as a restraint before when we spoke about it, and obviously it is in many ways, but actually when you have a little kind of, when you've got a little trajectory and you have an obsession with something, it doesn't feel like a restraint. It feels like inspiring because you're so focused on this one thing that, so that's quite an interesting duality, I think.
No, it's absolutely. I mean, with all these projects, I obviously have to do a bit of research first, because I can't put myself in a corner to the point where if I was to say, I want to make an hour-long mix of tracks all titled Xylophobia, and I only find 2 tracks, it's not going to work. But I mean, that is the surprising thing. It's like, I wonder how many tracks I'll find. And actually, there are quite a few out there. So yeah, with any of these projects, there is obviously a certain amount of research to figure out that there are enough tracks out there to work with the project. But I find it really, really interesting, because there's always the odd sort of curveball in there. You think you sort of think in your mind, well, okay, tracks that are titled Xylophobia, they're going to sound like this, and then all of a sudden you hear something and it's not at all what you expected. So I find that element fascinating. But also as well, I'm quite grateful for this opportunity with this podcast, because there's music that I would quite like to bring in and play that had I done a different mix, it could have been a mix where I just thought, what kind of music sounds like Xylophobia to me, and I might have brought in some particular tracks, and the sort of the minute I started to have these kind of ideas, there's a very, very obvious track that came to mind that I would like to play, and I toyed with the idea of having cover versions, but I feel like it does need to be the original, and that is A Forest by The Cure. that's kind of, for me, that's like a key track for this project. So whilst it's not in the mixes at all, it was a track that I kind of continually played in the car whilst I was working on this, or working on these mixes, should I say. I haven't finished, I've still got the third one to do, but it kind of sort of was company, if you will, whilst I was working on this mix. And all the other tracks that I want to include in the podcast are the same. So I started going off at sort of not quite tangents, but I was thinking, oh, well, you know, if I hadn't restricted myself so much to tracks that were either called Xylophobia for the first mix or Shinrin-yoku for the second mix, oh, well, I would have included this, or I would have included this. So I kind of, obviously I had to search for tracks titled Xylophobia and Shinrin-yoku online, because I didn't know of any off the top of my head, interestingly enough. So I used Bandcamp, Discogs, and SoundCloud, if I remember correctly. And then I found most of the music did come from Bandcamp, and I was quite what I usually do with any of these mixes, I kind of do buy the tracks as well. Yeah. Because I think it's important to support the artist. So it's not like I literally just record off the laptop. I do like to actually buy the track as a download. But whilst I was working on those, I was thinking, oh, well, what might the mix be if I hadn't restricted myself to just those two track titles? So a good friend of mine, Jerry, had sent me some sort of online vouchers for Sounds of the Universe, and that kind of coincided with thinking and working on this project. So I just put some key terms in Sounds of the Universe. I think I put wood in there. I think I put forest in there. Obviously, a whole load of things, group trees speak. So I'd really like to play their track Sleep Crime from the album Ohms. And also it led me to a CD called Wooden Music by Thomas Stanko Quintet. And that's kind of I think 6 pieces, and I'd really like to play piece 4 from that. And the interesting thing about that particular release, the Wooden Music by Thomas Stanko Quintet, is the liner, well, not the liner notes. There's me going all vinyl. It's actually a CD booklet. They discuss how he had like a wooden business card that he would hand out, and the kind of the writers discussing the sound of the wooden business card, and how it kind of it snaps a bit like a match, he says. And he kind of compares that. He asks the question, what would a business card sounded like if it was sort of folded in half? And I guess you automatically think of what a cardboard business card would sound like. So in the CD booklet for Wooden Music 1 by Thomas Stanko Quartet, the first words are as follows: what sound does a business card make when folded in half? They're usually made of paper, but this particular one from the 1970s is made of thin wood. It is usually presented to festival representatives, journalists, agents. When they fold it, it cracks with a slight dry snap, just like a match. In the middle, there are the musicians' names, along with Pagart's contact details, and at the top, written in various fonts, the name Thomas Stanko Quintet. The Polish trumpeter decided to order these when he and his bandmates labelled what they played as wooden music. So the business cards play too. So I think it's just this whole idea of sound. Sound in writing is really, really interesting to me. I was led to a fantastic novella by Algernon Blackwood by an Instagram post by the cultural critic and writer Mark Deary. And he had a post that he titled after Algernon Blackwood's novella, The Man Whom the Trees Loved. And Blackwood was totally new to me. The name was kind of relatively familiar, but I hadn't read anything by him at all. And so I read this short novella and absolutely blown away by the way that he kind of writes about sound and sound within nature and sound within trees, which kind of, just really worked for the duration of this commission.
Yeah. So all of this research was kind of going on in the background while you were piecing together.
Yeah, absolutely. So, whilst I was thinking literally about this, this discussion that we're having now, I was kind of thinking, well, I would like to bring in some of these pieces of music that I was kind of listening to at the same time, because I've made the mixes are done, but obviously there's always, and I've always played music, back when I was a student, or when I was creating work for exhibitions, I was always sort of thinking about what I'd play in the studio. And actually I've got a book by the artist Jenny C. Jones called Compilation, and there's a great quote in there where she was discussing the kind of time that she would put into curating music to play in her studio. And there was this realization, and she thought, well, actually this is part of my practice as well. And I think it's when you read something like that and you're like, well, there are other people out there doing this as well. I think that's really enriching. I think, sure. Whilst I was thinking about this particular discussion we're having now, I was thinking, I want to bring this in and I want to bring this in. Lots of different sorts of music that kind of links together somehow.
It's like the
exactly. So the DVD extras for the mixers, but it's like footnotes as well, isn't it? It's like I love footnotes or endnotes and kind of referencing and I love intertextuality. All of that I find absolutely fascinating. All those different connections. I find it really fascinating the mixes that you're putting together as well. That link to the podcasts. And I just love that, this kind of idea of circling back, or the as with the previous podcasts that you've done as well, and the kind of with the discussions with the artists after the work has been exhibited or performed. And I think these conversations is really interesting. So there's the kind of the work almost has another life beyond its exhibition. It has other values on different platforms.
I guess it kind of speaks to what you do in that I think James describes the podcast as a sort of like experimental exhibition space, and I think that it is a really kind of experimental way of showing work or thinking about artwork in a different way. And actually it reminds me of the book I mentioned by Snejanka Mihailova called Acoustic Thought, where she reimagines the Gospel of Thomas. And I'm just reading through my notes here where I wrote that according to Mihailova, the Gospel of Thomas is a poem that listens, where the written is not simply the record of a voice, but a radically different dimension of cognition that emerges as an acoustic realm in the formation of thought, which I know it's not like a black and white thing, but I guess the idea of thinking through listening and listening through speaking and, this kind of in between acoustic thought idea is just really lovely. And it's almost like the playlists or track lists. And it would be interesting to hear you describe the difference between the idea of playlist and track list as well, because I thought that was really interesting.
I view a track, I call them track lists for the mixes, purely because, well, no, not purely, mainly because Mixcloud used the word track list, but I think as well it implies a certain sort of fixity. Mm-hmm. And whilst people can obviously kind of skip through, depending on depending if they subscribe to Mixcloud, etc. I know there's only a certain amount of sort of skipping or sort of going forward, etc., that you can do if you're not a sort of paid up member of Mixcloud, if you will. But generally speaking, the idea is that someone listens to it from, you know, start to end. And to me, the word playlist suggests that you could play that music in a different order or listen to it in a different order, whereas a track list to me does imply a certain fixity, and there's a sequence, and those tracks have been recorded in that sequence, and the idea being that you listen in that sequence as well. But yeah, the idea of kind of listening back is something that I find really interesting, and the idea of the relationships between all of these works, whether it's the, you know, like I said before, the kind of podcasts in relation to the artist's work, and in this particular instance as well, the two mixes that are already you know, part of the Xylophobia online that are on the Fermyn Woods website. That the third mix I'm going to make is going to include tracks from the first two, where I'm going to kind of pit sort of the tracks titled Xylophobia with, and layer them with tracks titled Shinrin-yoku to see what might happen, and to kind of think about the sort of the contrast between music titled in what might seem like quite opposite ways. But also I want to bring in some field recordings that I did in Fermyn Woods Country Park. And kind of the reason being, obviously Fermyn Woods Contemporary Art and Fermyn Woods Country Park share the name Fermyn Woods, but they are two different places. And there's sometimes some confusion there. People naturally make an association and think that Fermyn Woods Contemporary Art is actually in Fermyn Woods Country Park, etc., etc. But it kind of goes back to the, you know, you mentioned sort of Algernon Blackwood's writing and how he's kind of describing sound and the sound of trees or wind through trees, etc., etc. So I was kind of very attuned to that when I went to Fermyn Woods Country Park, and I kind of went sort of late evening as it was getting dark. So the early recordings I made, there was kind of lots of bird song. Then as it got darker, I started to sort of notice the trees, or could hear the trees sort of creaking, things like that, which I found sort of fascinating. And in those two recordings, it's almost like I had some sort of Xylophobia recordings and some Shinrin-yoku recordings. So I want to sort of bring those into the mix as well.
It really goes back to the idea of that you said about kind of collecting ephemera from different times, the podcast circling back on itself, you circling back on itself, the idea that sound kind of transcends temporal coordinates because it's just like, it's not visible, so it could be anything, you know. That's a really fascinating kind of representation of those ideas layered on top of each other, you know. I find that really fascinating.
Yeah, I have to say I haven't actually started on this third mix yet, so I've got these ideas, and I'm obviously talking about it sort of ahead of making it. But there's a record label, that absolutely fantastic record label called Disciples, relatively new record label, and they have this great sort of idea where they bring the releases out on vinyl. I don't think I don't think they've put anything out on CD yet. I could be wrong, but vinyl's the main format. But then between the releases, they have like what they call 0.5 releases, and they're on cassette, and they're kind of like I'm trying to think of what they describe them. I think they describe them as like a sort of almost like deep dives, or like sort of like an alternate take, if you will. And sometimes the the albums that have been released or the master recordings of those albums are given to another artist to kind of remix or reimagine in a different way. And I sort of think of this podcast in a way as because it's between the second and third mix. I like to think of it as a sort of an equivalent of the Disciples' fantastic sort of cassette releases. So it's kind of me thinking about the mixes I've already made, but in a slightly different way, but kind of drawing in all these other influences, seeing where it might go. But that does bring me to another track that I do really want to play from the record label Disciples, and it's from the artist His Name Is Alive. And I was sort of thinking about this podcast and sort of music, all the tracks I wanted to play, and I thought that the kind of projects that I'd done previously, where the artwork on record sleeves was really important. So I sort of thought immediately of records that I had or CDs that I had where sort of trees featured very prominently on the covers, and the records that His Name Is Alive put out on Disciples, he basically put out three records of early recordings that he made on cassette when he was young, between I think 1979 and 1990. And there was me saying earlier about Disciples not putting out many CDs, and of course they did put out His Name Is Alive's record, the three records that I just mentioned. Sorry, they put them together as a sort of CD box set, but there was an additional a fourth CD which brought together the 0.5 cassette releases, and there's a track on the cassette called Ghost Tape EXP called Sleep Through, but on the CD, which is Keep the Moon on Time, it's actually called Slept Through. But I think it is the same track. It's just one of those things, has a slightly different title. But anyway, Slept Through by His Name Is Alive. the other records that immediately sprung to mind when I thought about trees or forests or woodland on record sleeves were the soundtrack to Twin Peaks.
Oh,
the
yes,
original,
of course.
the original TV series by Angelo Badalamenti.
Yes.
What a soundtrack.
Yeah, actually, myself and Astrid rewatched all of Twin Peaks together a few months ago.
I'm kind of envious. I need to do that myself, but I don't actually own them. But I need to do that.
It was really special
because I'm going way back to I remember when that was sort of broadcast on terrestrial TV and watching it, and just what an amazing experience it was watching all those.
Yeah,
it's just the way the music works so well with the various different episodes, the visuals, just stunning.
Yeah, I mean, Log Lady is like, her character is Xylophobia. I don't know like how these two things seem to fit so well together, but the way she's sort of like this medium between the kind of magical natural world and like the town of Twin Peaks is just so, she is like a transistor radio between the two,
Yeah, absolutely.
And yeah, she is just so strange and terrifying but endearing. And that
is the thing with Twin Peaks, isn't it? There's all these kind of I guess like ambiguities, or kind of there's all these puzzles and things not quite adding up, and there's various different clues, and there's the when he's talking about looping back earlier in the discussion, obviously you've got that in Twin Peaks, in the visuals, in the audio, the kind of the sampling of the resampling of elements that are in various different tracks on that album. I think it's sort of Laura Palmer's theme, and the way that kind of comes back in. I think it's the Bookhouse Boys, the track The Bookhouse Boys. There's some fascinating, very short little sort of clips of Angelo Badalamenti on YouTube. I don't know if have you seen them?
No, I haven't.
They're really interesting. So he's talking about the way that David Lynch kind of approached the music, and kind of these conversations that he would have with Angelo Badalamenti as he sat at the piano. And he was sort of saying about, so David Lynch is describing his vision for these kind of terrifying woods, and this girl in the woods, and he's explaining it to Angelo Badalamenti and asking him to play. But of course Lynch hadn't shot anything at that point. And he's discussing, I just find it fascinating, and he kind of can get Badalamenti to play, and obviously Badalamenti, a fantastic musician, and he's sort of encouraging him to play slower and sort of slower. So I started to do a little bit more research on sort of the soundtrack. David Lynch and Badalamenti working together, and they had this term they called firewood for sort of short or passages of music that they would maybe incorporate in later works. And I thought, that's just so good. We started off talking about the record sleeve and the image from that, and Log Lady and the woods, and then kind of, to find out that they had this term that they used. I mean, I don't know if it is a recognized term in music or if it's something they come up with themselves, but I'm just fascinated. They've got this term that they used to describe these passages of music that they recorded together that they maybe then use in something else. Firewood. That's great.
It's like a kind of form of synesthesia, is to be able to just hear someone explain a story, and for it to become acoustic like that is just amazing.
Absolutely. And it just works so well, doesn't it? I mean, what a fantastic meeting of kind of visual and auditory.
Yeah, for sure.
I guess we should probably play Laura Palmer's theme after that. So yeah, that as we keep saying, that soundtrack is so amazing. So I kind of would like to play another track from it actually, and it kind of links with with this idea of things kind of looping around and sort of sampling from and recontextualizing or connections or intertextuality, all those kind of things, and that's the track, the Bookhouse Boys. If you listen to that, I'm sure you will probably hear what sounds suspiciously like Laura Palmer's theme to me. And actually, on that note, what I would also like to say, talking about sort of memories and things like that, is kind of, I just wonder if anyone, when they heard Laura Palmer's theme, if anyone sort of also heard Moby's Go, which obviously famously sampled Laura Palmer's theme. So I kind of, when I hear Laura Palmer's theme, I kind of also a little bit hear Go as well.
Really?
Yeah, kind of, it's one of those interesting, obviously you don't literally hear it, but it's kind of, it's kind of there because the sample was obviously such a massive part of that track by Moby.
Derrida played himself in a film.
Ghost Dance.
Yeah. I don't know anyone else who's seen that.
Film. I love that film.
Yeah. You know, when he phones and then he's like, I'm haunting you by making this phone call. Like, my voice is haunting you. Yeah. That's what that just made me think of. Like, all those traces of memory and voice and, yeah.
And you know what? That's, there was me getting ready to introduce the Bookhouse Boys by Angelo Badalamenti from the Twin Peaks soundtrack, which I'm sure we'll get around to listening to shortly. But the soundtrack to that film, Ghost Dance, it is so, and I had to track that down. And it's David Cunningham, isn't it? I believe David Cunningham. I managed to track down a CD copy of it. I think I can't remember if it's on eBay or Discogs, but I was so pleased. It's another one of those soundtracks that is just, I've just got to get that soundtrack. It's just stunning. Yeah.
I actually, I watched it on YouTube years ago, the film, because I was just like starting to read Mark Fisher, and I just don't know anyone else who's seen it, so I can't believe you knew what I was talking about.
I love that film. I remember watching it when I was a student on Channel 4, I think, and yeah, I'm sure I've got a DVD of it somewhere. I'm sure I managed to snap up a DVD. But yeah, fantastic film. I need to go and watch that again now. What a great film. Anyway, The Bookhouse Boys by Angelo Badalamenti from the Twin Peaks soundtrack.
Well, Maya Zacho spoke about this in the previous episode about how the listener naturally gets lost in thought listening to sounds because sound invites for fictioning in a way that other media can't really. So I was wondering about how these track lists have allowed you to kind of create a particular narrative, or is there a sense of fictioning in this process, or do you kind of consider the traditional order of beginning, middle, and end? Obviously, you've got 3 different mixes, so maybe that's something you've been thinking about, or is it far more complex? Is it like the giant coming in Twin Peaks saying it is happening again?
No, I think that's really interesting, and I do agree with what Maya said. Absolutely, I think music works in that way very much. I find what is particularly interesting is that I think all bar one of the tracks on the Xylophobia mix are instrumental. There's one little bit of dialogue in the sort of dubstep track towards the end, but Snapped Ankles is obviously a vocal track. And when you talk about order, I kind of felt, to me, it just felt natural. It felt right that was the last track. And that probably does come back to the fact that I think sort of inviting that fictioning is possibly kind of is easier, or is more conducive to invite that if it is instrumental music we're talking about. I think your thoughts can sort of wander without lyrical signposts, if you will. I think as soon as you bring lyrics in, it's more difficult potentially to come up with your own sort of narratives or stories or memories, etc. So I find that really interesting. And it was only when you when you sent me your thoughts through on that document and I read that, I was kind of like, of course. The idea of kind of circling back, or the idea of that sort of, I've always had a fascination with beginnings being ends and things like that. And so Chris Marker's La Jetée is probably, the best example I can think of that, where the beginning is the end. Which made me think maybe what I need, or what I would like to do, I've yet to make the third mix, but I'd quite like the final track of the third mix to be the same as the first track of the first mix. So there is that kind of like loop, and I don't necessarily expect anyone to listen to all 3 of them in one sitting and kind of come back to where they started, but I like the fact that it's kind of there. But I also wonder if I could maybe do it in sort of in miniature within the third mix, so maybe the first track of the third mix is also the same as the last track of the third mix. Got you. But that is obviously the first track of the first mix.
Yeah.
So it's of kind of sort of going around in circles here, but I do find that quite fascinating.
It is.
I do quite like a circular narrative.
I don't know if you're familiar with the short film that was made by Marcel Duchamp and Maya Deren. I can't remember what it was called, but it might. I can't remember what it was called, which is really annoying. But on Maya Deren's forehead, or the actress in the film, there's a circle with the words "the end is the beginning, is the end is the beginning, is the end."
No, I'm not familiar with that. I need to check that out.
Yeah, and the idea of a circular narrative, I think, is far more realistic than beginning, middle, and ends. I don't know if anyone has ever experienced a beginning, middle, and end in life. It's just not how things work, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's just so interesting, the idea that like a discussion that we had via that kind of that Google document kind of gets you thinking in different ways and kind of leads you down a different path, and you sort of bring in all these different elements together. I find it fascinating.
Yeah, for sure. And it reminds me of how Astrid and I first started working together was through making playlists during lockdown for an independent radio station in Aberdeen. And it was because I think it was in my final year art school, maybe Astrid's third year, we discovered this zine called Weird Walk that looked into like folk horror, and in the first publication, they talked about dungeon synth, and I think we both are kind of interested in fantasy and saw these medieval qualities to it. And
Right.
then there was a description of what dungeon synth tracks you should listen to while you go on a specific nature walk.
Brilliant.
And that is just kind of speaks to exactly what we've been kind of talking about today. It's the specificity, the site specificity,
absolutely.
the kind of looping.
Yeah, absolutely. It's these kind of different points and how they all connect. Yeah, it's really fascinating.
And it just shows the extent to which this particular method of art making can be so accessible to so many different people that it's almost like a recipe, you know, that you could listen to something specific at a specific place. And I know no one's experience is going to be the same, but that's the beauty of it, really.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I think that's really, really important. Yeah, definitely. And I guess as well, kind of whilst we're on the sort of topics of kind of looping back and links and things like that, I mentioned the record label Disciples earlier on, but there was a release by Maxine Funk called Pieces of Driftwood, if memory serves me correctly. And there's a track on that called Forest Photographer, which kind of makes me think back to our discussion earlier about Forest by The Cure. But yeah, I'd really like to play that track by Maxine Funk as well, Forest Photographer. It's great. It's got field recordings in it, and like I think I'm right in saying there's potentially, it sounds like maybe a microphone's been knocked within the recording.
Okay.
So I quite like that idea of, I could be wrong, it's maybe not that at all, but you know, I quite like the idea that you're reminded of the person that made the recording through that.
Yeah.
Well, I am through that sound. It might be something totally different, but that's kind of, when I heard that, that's kind of what I thought. And there's a couple of tracks, I think, in the Shinrin-yoku mix that also utilize field recordings. So that's kind of another reason why I wanted to bring my own field recordings in as well to my final mix, to kind of just sort of try and weave it all together and sort of make some sense of it all in the third mix, really.
Coming back to the idea of the end note or footnote, it actually makes me think of an essay, I don't know if you've come across it, called Nilling by Lisa Robertson. Well, it's in the book Nilling. The essay is called Time in the Codex or something like that. But most of the writing is in the footnotes. I've maybe asked this to other artists on the podcast, is how much do you reveal in the finished work? You know, how much do you say in spoken word about what it is you're trying to do? How much do you leave up to the listener or the viewer? And how do you yourself feel about maybe producing something where you were speaking through these ideas through the footnote, as it were?
That's a really interesting question. I guess I certainly want people to kind of take what they will from the work, if that makes sense. So whilst there is an order to the mixes and the way that they've been uploaded, obviously Xylophobia, it seemed right that was the first one, being as the whole program, the whole Fermyn Woods contemporary art program for the last couple of years is Xylophobia. It seemed natural that was the first one. So I guess the natural way to listen to those and the way they appear on the web page is obviously Xylophobia is first, followed by Shinrin-yoku, and then the last one, which actually will be broadcast on, or will premiere, should I say, on Resonance FM. So I think in October. So Bill and Helen, who I mentioned earlier from Workshop 24, they have a program on Resonance FM called Radio Public. So there's a nice link to the project I did in Dudley that I mentioned before, and then my third mix being premiered on Resonance FM. So I don't like to kind of dictate how people will, or how people should interpret the works at all. I think, people will take from those mixes what they want. But the idea of kind of how much I reveal of the work, or how much I'm kind of, like I said, the kind of the podcast and the connection between the podcast and the mixes I find really interesting. And as well, the fact that I'm trying to think which one it was now. It wasn't Maya's, the podcast you did with Maya. I think it was one of them's got a reading list at the end. I think it was the one before Maya.
Oh yes, with the discussion with Johannes and Danny. Yes,
that's it. Yes, I think that's the one. So I like the idea that there might be. We're saying obviously we're jumping through time now. I'm saying might be, and obviously this is going to be all put together and up on. So it's this whole right, okay. So yeah, the reading list at the end, if you will. There'll be those those people that might go off and find those books, maybe read some of those books. I find that really, really interesting as well, and the links between the different podcasts, and the kind of the fact that we're already referencing previous podcasts, and I'm sure that Twin Peaks has been discussed before as well, which
I think it's been mentioned, but maybe not.
Yeah, or maybe mentioned. Yeah. But I think that's great. So there are these kind of clues, I guess, through the different media, that kind of maybe signposts people to like influences, or what else might be going on in the work. But I don't tend to, I really enjoy talking about other people's work, or discussing music, or discussing maybe what informed the work. So I think that's really important as well, and I really enjoy that element of it.
Yeah, something I've been thinking about a lot in my own practice is the kind of idea of the lecture performance. I really like the kind of line between what could be just the artist talking about their work and that actually becoming the work in itself, which I suppose the podcast kind of does it too. But yeah, it's just kind of interesting how you can break down these boundaries of what we think of as, for example, a playlist or a track list or a radio show or a podcast or a story or a song, or it's just, that's when the most exciting things happen.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's what's really interesting about what Fermyn Woods contemporary art's doing at the moment, with obviously with Sapphire's visuals as well.
Yes, yeah.
There's another way for people to kind of engage with the podcast, and we'll give you will have a different experience if you're listening and watching on one platform versus listening maybe on another platform. So I find all of this, really, really fascinating as well. Really interesting.
Yeah. And it's so kind of malleable. Every episode feels completely different, and I'm sure it's the same for you with each mix. It's felt like each one has such a clear identity, but they all kind of flow into each other at the same time.
Yeah, I feel that's a really, really good way. If I just sort of remind myself of that, but just thinking, for me, that's where I know it's working, I guess, or if there is if I think it's successful, if there are those threads, if you will, that kind of make it, I guess, kind of make it yours in a way, but no, I don't mean that in a possessive way, but I mean, so it kind of it's recognized as being something that you've created, I guess, if you will. So these common connections, or these links that run through things, and I think that's what with the podcast that you've been doing, with the kind of the introduction that's the same. So there's that continuity, but then there's the podcast that follows, the discussions between yourself and the artists might be very different, or the if it isn't a discussion, it's a an audio work in itself that maybe is not discussion. It might be what could be described as sound art. And I think that's really interesting, because you've got, like you say, you've got the continuity, but you've got the difference there as well. There's a fantastic publication published by the Grass is Green in the Fields for You, and it's music writing by David Roeder, and it kind of brings me back to Disciples record label, and His Name Is Alive and Slept Through. And on the Disciples Bandcamp page, the label describes that particular track, Slept Through, as I think it's grouper-esque. I can't remember the exact words now. I haven't got it in front of me, but I was like, I really need to kind of check Grouper out more, because it's a name that I, sort of obviously familiar with. Liz Harris, amazing musician, but hadn't really kind of investigated her music. And I then kind of got hold of this book by David Roeder called Watercolor of Jam Deck Debut. And in it, he's got this really great piece about how difficult it is to write about groupers' music. But in particular, the two albums that kind of came out together, sort of partnered albums, which are Alien Observer and Dream Loss. And he talks about how he prefers Dream Loss, but everything he reads, or it seems to kind of go the other way. He says how, most people tend to prefer Alien Observer. I have to say I'm agreement with David Roeder. I do prefer Dream Loss myself. So there's this connection, obviously, within the kind of podcast here, talking about one thing referencing another and referencing another, and we've talked about going round in circles, and I've talked about Disciples I don't know how many times, but I really wanted to play the track An Other by Grouper, which is from the album Dream Loss. yeah, Jerome Ellis. That was another record that I came to because of the image on the sleeve.
What is the image on the sleeve of that one?
So it's an image of a clearing in a forest. There's a lovely visual description on the inside. Yeah, a conifer forest. The photo is of a conifer forest clearing with some snow on the ground and sky above the tree line. In the lower left corner of the photo are a tenor saxophone, hammered dulcimer, flute, microphone stand, microphone, synthesizer, and laptop computer standing in the clearing. The liner notes are in black text on a cyan background. For sound description and additional album information, visit nnatapes.com. So I wanted to play a track from Jerome Ellis's fantastic album called The Clearing. But I should probably mention that the album has like a partner work, which kind of fits with the whole kind of discussion we've had really about the connections, intertextuality, etc. The book of the same title. So Jerome Ellis has a stutter, a glottal block in particular. And it's a beautiful, powerful album in which he discusses his stutter. I believe he plays all the instruments on the album as well. But this was another record that immediately kind of come to mind in my collection when I was thinking about records that included like forests or your woodland trees, etc. on the sleeve. So I was immediately drawn to this. But the book as well, which I say is absolutely fantastic, corresponds with the album, and each page of the book corresponds to a minute of the audio on the album. So it's kind of somewhat like concrete poetry, I guess, where you've got the lyrics, but then you've got the representation of the stutter as well in terms of how the letters are kind of placed on the page. You know, the gorgeous color, the cyan color that links the album to the book as well. And yeah, the track I wanted to play is basically the single edit of Loops of Retreat, which is a long track on the album, but there is a shorter version of it. So Loops of Retreat, single edit by Jerome Ellis.
My thesis is that blackness is fluency and music are forces that open time. Opening brings possibilities. Temporal refusal, temporal escape, temporal descent. But because thesis also refers to a downbeat in music, my thesis must move, must metamorphose like music. Sound is vibration, a wavering band of energy, endless restlessness. For us to perceive sound, the sound waves emitting from the sound source must make our eardrums vibrate. W.E.B. Du Bois begins each chapter in The Souls of Black Folk with lyrics and a few bars of musical notation from spirituals. With this With this gesture, he makes the page vibrate, tremble. So the beat goes on and new theses arise with each laying down a foot to ground. For thesis also refers to the stressed syllable of a foot in verse. Harriet Jacobs reminds us that black loops in black music, including but not limited to rap and house, are always black loopholes of retreat. That black music, like black escape, is a never-ending activity and never an achievement. And when the black stutterer loops a phoneme, mother, this too is a black loop, black music, black activity. My thesis is that if fluent speech has been used to police the border between humans and non-humans, or subhumans, then black his fluency places the paradox of black humanity in the body, in the throat. Are black people humans? The jury's still out on that. And who's on the jury? We live within the veil, and the veil is ever waving. How can we think about blackness and disfluency together? We can begin here.
Yeah, it's a fantastic album. Really, really good. And when we was talking about writing about sound and wood, etc., and that was kind of in Roland Barthes' Mythologies, where he's the chapter Toys, where he's talking about wooden toys, and he says, when the child handles it and knocks it, it neither vibrates nor grates. It has a sound at once muffled and sharp.
And everyone can remember having wooden toys and the sensory experience of that. I'm sure.
Absolutely.
You know.
Yeah. Absolutely.
It's so profound as a child, that feeling and that sound and that texture, and you know.
Yeah, and the fact they last. You know, they don't tend to end up in landfill like cheap plastic toys that sort of break and just probably don't get recycled, even though they potentially get sent to a recycling plant, or they get recycled and you know, pollute the environment all over again. But yeah, it's that whole idea of this, just wood, the sound of wood, you know, just really, really interesting.
Do you find that by including your own field recording in the final one, do you feel like it's a very different process to the previous two? Do you feel like you're being more vulnerable in any way, or does it feel just like a natural kind of just adding yourself into the mix in some way?
I think it is very much, it's very much that, what you said. I think it is that element of adding myself into the mix. But I think I've done a couple of things previously as well, a couple of works previously whereby I did sort of bring field recording into a sort of an audio mix, and I felt it kind of worked, and it was something I wanted to to do within this commission as well. So last summer I was involved in a project called Radio Public in Dudley. Workshop 24 invited me to Dudley to be part of this mini one-day festival they had. So Bill Laybourne and Helen Garbutt invited me. They're Workshop 24, and they wanted someone that worked with music and sound. And I had this idea of asking people to go and pick records from the charity shop on the high street, and then I'd make a mix with what they picked. So I kind of left some money behind the till in a couple of different charity shops on the high street, and just said to people, go to the counter, tell them that you're doing the project for Spencer, pick something and bring it back to me. It could be a record, it could be a CD. So that was really interesting. That kind of linked back to some of my earlier works as well. It's like why people pick particular things. So that was kind of interesting to me. But what I did for that project as well is I did some field recording on the high street as well. So that mix is obviously very, very much rooted, to Dudley High Street, if you will. And then I think it must have been, I'm getting confused now between my years. It's COVID.
Yeah,
it's the lockdown.
confusing.
I can't remember what year was what. But so the piece of work that I did an episode of Where the Dead Voices Gather for Paul Natterage. That was on Resonance Extra, and because of that, the way that program had to be put together, according to very particular constraints that Paul set up. Whereby you had to choose the tracks according to a 2-letter code, and the 2-letter code was generated from Paul sort of extracting a haiku out of the book Where Dead Voices Gather by Nick Tosh. So the first letter of the code was the band name. The second letter of the code was the track title. But then you had to pick each track from a particular library. So when I say library, I mean as in like a particular place. So one of the libraries, as Paul calls them, was a charity shop. So you had your code, but you had to pick that track from a charity shop. That's actually quite challenging.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Because you're restricted to this code. But another one was field recordings. So you had to get a track or a field recording, if you will. Also potentially a track that obviously worked with this code. So that was where I first sort of brought field recording into an audio mix. And every episode you listen to of Where the Dead Voices Gather will have a field recording in it, because that's the nature of the constraints, the restrictions that Paul set up. So that was basically where the journey started with me, this idea of bringing field recordings into music. And obviously, there's so many artists doing that now, but I found it really interesting. And like you said, it's kind of sort of bringing yourself into the mix a little bit more. And because I'm not a musician, and I don't really classify myself as a DJ either, for that note, it is a way of bringing more of me into it, if you will, as opposed to the idea of just sort of sequencing and trying to sort of layer sounds, but sort of bringing that element into it as well. I sort of said I don't refer to myself as a DJ. I guess probably primarily because usually the reason I pick a particular track or incorporate a particular track within a mix is not usually due to the sound, or it's not to get a particular reaction, or it's because it's titled something specific. So Xylophobia, or it's got the word Detroit in the title, or it's got the word country in the title. So there's all these other reasons. Now I'm sort of aware of various different radio programs that do get themed and they get put together with similar things. So I'm aware that there are sort of maybe broadcast DJs that are possibly doing not dissimilar things, but I've kind of come to it more through the visual arts, but it just happened to have sort of ended up using audio more as much as visual, if you will.
You can find more from Spencer at his website, spencergraham.net. Accompanying images for this episode are at our website. There are links to all of this in the episode description, as always. Xylophobia Online, running until the 22nd of April 2024, of which Spencer is part of, is an exhibition of digitally based work which, of course, takes its name from the fear of wooden objects, forests, or wooded areas. Responding to the increased needs and fears of outdoor activities in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, the featured work presents explorative, experimental, and conceptual spaces at this intersection, whilst inquisitive and mindful of the environmental impact of creating and presenting artworks using digital technology. Listeners on Spotify are able to experience an accompanying video to this episode by artist Sapphire Goss. And for listeners on other platforms, you can find Sapphire's work on our website. All of this will, of course, also be included in this episode description. Sapphire Goss is a multimedia artist who uses obsolete technologies to explore experimental materiality and hybrid collaborative forms to make work that grows, decays, and lives beyond the screen. She creates chimerical imagery using unexpected materials, looping and processing to make an analog uncanny, resulting in these grainy, shimmering, otherworldly bursts of light and emotion that are both moving and mysterious. As always, a wonderful accompaniment to this audio work. This episode has been edited by Astrid Bjorklund, the other half of Subterra. Thank you for listening to the Fermyn Woods Contemporary Art Podcast. If you enjoy our podcast, please make sure to positively rate, review, and subscribe on your podcatcher. It helps other people find the podcast, and it really does make us feel good about ourselves. This podcast series is part of Xylophobia, Fermyn Woods Contemporary Art's new 2-year program funded by Arts Council England. Visit fermynwoods.org for more information on our program and to sign up to our monthly email newsletter. Follow us at Fermyn Woods on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, and make sure to check out Subterra at Subterrestrials on Instagram. Thanks for listening, and hope to see you back here soon.